Once upon a time, in the ancient prehistoric year of 2013, a show would come out. A show that, for a very brief period of time, would take over the entire world. You could not go a single day without hearing about this show, whether it be in person or online. It was just inescapable. Everyone knew this show. Everyone loved this show. It was the biggest show in the world. And then, almost as soon as it took the world by storm, it just disappeared. Its relevance in pop culture would slowly but surely die down. Fewer and fewer people began to care about the show the longer it went on. And before you knew it, this once critically acclaimed, universally beloved show was now widely ridiculed all around the internet. If you even dared to say anything positive about this show nowadays, you would be ridiculed, no exceptions. It's gotten to a point where people look at this show and think, this was never good to begin with, why did we think this was good? This isn't an ordinary case of seasonal rot or anything like that, no. This isn't a show that had its moment in the spotlight and then just became irrelevant, but is still fairly popular, like you could still find fans of it. No, this was a show that used to be the biggest fucking thing in the world, and now I see almost no one talk about it. I see almost no one acknowledge its existence, and on the rare instances where I see people talk about it, it's almost always in a negative light. Why is that the case, you might be asking? Well, that's what we're here for. We're gonna go over the history of this show to figure out why the show's reputation did a complete 180. This is the rise and fall of Rick and Morty. How the most critically acclaimed cartoon of the 2010s became a laughingstock on the internet. Let us begin. Rick and Morty is a show created by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland. The show first premiered on Adult Swim on December 2nd, 2013, and upon its release, the show received near universal acclaim from critics and audiences alike. The show follows Rick Sanchez and his grandson Morty Smith, who are both intended to be parodies of Doc Brown and Marty McFly, the main characters of Back to the Future. Alongside the titular duo, you have Jerry, Morty's father, Beth, Morty's mother and Rick's daughter, and Summer, Morty's sister and Rick's granddaughter. There are tons of other characters on this show, and I mean tons of them, but these are the core 5 main characters of the show. Rick is a scientist, and so throughout the show, he and Morty travel through different universes and dimensions, coming across aliens, other variants of Rick and Morty, and just different weird, surreal, interdimensional beings in general. As mentioned before, the show was critically acclaimed, in part because of the surreal, unique nature that it had. When the show first came out, people praised how different and unique it was when compared to other adult cartoons. It was seen as this breath of fresh air adult cartoon, and it very quickly became the flagship show for Adult Swim. Now, despite being universally acclaimed when it first came out, Rick and Morty wasn't exactly mainstream, if that makes sense. In its early days, Rick and Morty didn't really have much of a presence on social media, despite being universally acclaimed. You gotta remember that the internet was a very different place in 2014 and 2015 when compared to how it would be in the years to come. As the years went by, Rick and Morty started growing more and more in popularity. Its fan base would keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's with this where we can move on to the meat and potatoes of this topic. 2017. Arguably the year that Rick and Morty broke out into the mainstream. And even if it was already mainstream beforehand, this was undeniably the year that Rick and Morty peaked in popularity. 2017 would be a milestone year for the show for a multitude of reasons. Number one, this would be the year that the third season of the show would premiere. And looking at the massive fan base that the show had garnered in the time between 2013 to 2017, that naturally made a lot of people hungry for season 3. People were just waiting for it to finally come out, to finally premiere, to finally get more of the genius writing from Dan and Justin. Actually, that might be poor wording on my part. You're gonna see why in a little bit. Now, even though 2017 was the year that Rick and Morty peaked in popularity, it would also be the year where people would start to look at the show a little bit differently. The aforementioned season 3 of the show, again, premiered in 2017, and I remember even back during that time, there were people that thought season 3 wasn't as good as the first 2 seasons. I would see people say that, season 3 was still good, but it just wasn't as great as seasons 1 or 2. And then I would also find people that thought season 3 was terrible and a massive downgrade from the first 2 seasons. In retrospect, a lot of people point to season 3 as being when the show went downhill. The infamous Pickle Rick episode, which would indeed come from season 3, I would say was the moment that the show jumped the shark. And that's saying a lot considering the fact that Rick and Morty is meant to be a weird, surreal, over-the-top cartoon. The kind of cartoon where they jump the shark in every episode. So for me to say that Pickle Rick was when the show jumped the shark, that is saying a lot right there. That is saying a lot. But the main focus of this segment isn't the show itself. No, it's the fan base that the show garnered. Now, as previously mentioned, Rick and Morty was growing more and more in popularity, and that would naturally mean that its fan base would just continue to grow more and more as well. And as a result of this, this would lead to both the fan base and the show itself garnering a reputation of sorts. In retrospect, I like to consider 2017 the final year of the cringe era. You know that era where everyone looked at certain things and were like, oh, this is cringe, this is cancer, this makes me want to drink bleach, am I right, guys? You think of edgy 2016 era YouTube, Pyrocynical, Leafy is here, Filthy Frank, stuff like that. People would look at certain things and think, oh, this is cringe, why do people like this? It's so cringe, guys, it's cringe, am I right? My Little Pony is cringe. Sonic is cringe. Why do people like these cringy things? They're cringe, guys. I'm gonna make a cringe compilation talking about how cringy these cringy things are. And Rick and Morty would have the misfortune of being one of the final victims of cringe culture before it would just die down. The cringe era, I think, lasted from 2014 to 2017. Maybe a little bit of it was still alive in 2018, but to a significantly lesser extent. But by 2019, cringe culture was largely dead, with the very minor exception of those Fortnite is bad memes from around that time, which, ironically enough, those themselves are cringe. And unlike many other things that were called cringy during this time, like Minecraft, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Undertale, Rick and Morty would never recover from the cringe reputation that it had garnered. There would never be a re-evaluation for Rick and Morty. Nobody would look at Rick and Morty and think, hey, you know what, this is actually kind of good, I don't know why I called it cringe, in the same way people did for Five Nights at Freddy's and Minecraft. The moment Rick and Morty became cringe, it forever stayed cringe. Its reputation would never improve. So let's talk about that, shall we? There were three primary reasons as to why the Rick and Morty fanbase garnered the cringe reputation that it has now. And I think it only makes sense to start with probably the least bad of the three. I don't know. It's still admittedly cringy and embarrassing, but it's relatively harmless in a way when compared to the other two reasons. I am of course talking about the Rick and Morty musicallys. And now some of you could be asking, what the hell is a musically? Well, let me explain it to you. Remember Vine? Remember when Vine was a thing? Got really big around 2013, 2014, I don't know, and then it shut down in 2016. Now, how many of y'all know about this little obscure app called TikTok? I'm sure most of you have. You've probably never heard of it. It's this very unknown, obscure app. Well, in between Vine's shutdown and the rise of TikTok, there was Musical.ly, the forgotten, lesser-known middle child of the three. Musical.ly was intended as a spiritual successor to Vine after it was shut down in 2016. It was pretty big in 2017, however in 2018 it would end up being rebranded to TikTok. It would end up being rebranded to the app that we all know and love, hate, I don't know, today. I want to imagine there are a lot of people that are nostalgic for the Vine era. Maybe there are people that are nostalgic for when they made Vines themselves. Maybe they're nostalgic for a lot of the memes that would come out of the Vine era. And TikTok is, well, I mean, it's TikTok. It doesn't really need much of an introduction. You already know it. But nobody remembers Musical.ly. It's just a thing that came and went, and even though Musical.ly technically still lives on in the form of TikTok, no one remembers how TikTok was during its early stages. But anyways, during its very brief existence, Musical.ly had one big trend attached to it. Rick and Morty. A lot of people would dress up as characters from Rick and Morty, usually the titular duo themselves. And a lot of them would just be them lip-syncing. Maybe it could be them lip-syncing to a song, lip-syncing to a scene from the show, that sort of thing. Basic TikTok fare, even though this was before TikTok. Most people, though, didn't really take a liking to this. This was something that the internet thought was cringe and lame and uncool. And admittedly, a lot of these musicallys, it's so hard for me to not refer to them as TikToks because they're technically not TikToks. Yeah, they are admittedly pretty embarrassing. I could imagine an alternate universe where it's like I had a Musical.ly account and I would make like these Rick and Morty musicallys. I would like dress up as Morty, lip-singing to a random song, and then years later I would look back on this time and I would think, oh god, this was embarrassing. It's normal, it happens. But even though a lot of these are really stupid and dumb and admittedly cringe, they're mostly just harmless. They're just people having fun. People dressing up as their favorite characters and just lip-singing to a song or reenacting a scene from the show, that sort of thing. And to be honest, on very rare occasions, there would be Rick and Morty musicallys that weren't really all that cringe. I mean, just look at this guy. He's just dancing. He's just busting a move. Let him be. Let him do his own thing. Nothing wrong with that at all. Of course, though, a lot of people on the internet looked at these musicallys and thought, this was cringy. This sets a bad image for the Rick and Morty fanbase. Big YouTubers like PewDiePie, Pyrocynical, and I Hate Everything would all make videos during this time talking about the Rick and Morty fanbase, giving particular attention to the musicallys, believing that they made both the normal fans of Rick and Morty itself look bad.
My children, as of late, the internet has come under attack by an unspeakable evil. A force so great with its darkness, it threatens to consume all of mankind. Men, women, children, memes, no one is safe from this horde of monstrosity. Because today, I will be talking about the Rick and Morty fan base.
It's kind of ironic that I bring up PewDiePie in this, considering the fact that he himself would end up having a Reddit reputation soon after. What the hell is a Reddit reputation, you may be asking? Well, I'll explain what that is when we get there. As I mentioned before though, a lot of these musicallys were just people reenacting scenes from the show, and yet these were seen as cringe and unfunny, even though they're literally just the exact same thing as from the original show. Like, take this one for example.
I have a new catchphrase.
Oh yeah? What's that, Rick?
I love my grandkids.
Aww.
Psych, just kidding. My new catchphrase is, I don't give a
Just
shake that ass, bitch, and let me see what you...
How did this happen? How did this come?
I don't give a just shake that ass, bitch, and let me see what you...
I just don't understand. Like, it's Rick and Morty. It doesn't make any sense. Why do you do this? Stop.
The original scene of that from the show would be considered funny and hilarious, but because it's two people reenacting it in real life on Musical.ly, it was considered dumb and cringy and unfunny, even though it's almost essentially the exact same thing. I'm not bringing this up to point out that like, oh, these people are hypocrites, double standards, etc. I'm not saying that at all because, again, you gotta remember, this was 2017. This was a very different time. I'm pointing out this specific detail mainly because it would unintentionally foreshadow the way that people would look at Rick and Morty in the future. It would foreshadow the way that people looked at Rick and Morty's style of humor. The aforementioned videos that I brought up all praise Rick and Morty, acknowledging that even if it did have a terrible fan base, it was still a good show. Of course, this is all stuff that I will go into further detail about much later on in this video. But yeah, Musical.ly was a thing. If you forgot that Musical.ly existed, now you remember it existed. And there were a lot of Rick and Morty Musical.lys that were being made, and I mean a lot of them. And for better or worse, when Musical.ly became TikTok, this trend did not carry on over. And yes, admittedly, a lot of these are very cringy, embarrassing. I want to imagine the people that made these back in 2017, they would look back on them and think, yeah, this is embarrassing, why did I do this? Now, this really shouldn't go without saying, but please do not go out of your way to harass any of the people that made these Musical.lys. I feel like this isn't really as effective as I would like it to be because this is a defunct social media app, but still, I'd rather be safe and put that out there. I know that these are cringy, they're embarrassing and whatever, but they're ultimately just harmless. They're just people having fun. They're not hurting anyone by making these. It's not worth harassing these people just because they made a couple dumb but harmless shorts based on a now irrelevant cartoon on a defunct social media app from 7 years ago. It's just not worth it at all. You're better than that. I know it. That being said, now I think it's time to look at the second reason as to why Rick and Morty's fanbase garnered a bad reputation. And let me just say, this next reason is going to be a lot cringier in comparison to the Musical.lys. Now, as I mentioned numerous times before, 2017 was a milestone year for the show. It was arguably the year that Rick and Morty truly broke out into the mainstream, and it became largely popular on a lot of different social media websites, including Reddit. Now, I'd say around this time, or maybe shortly after, Reddit would start to develop a pretty bad reputation online, which, to be honest, isn't really saying much nowadays, considering the fact that I'm pretty sure all social media apps and websites and whatever have bad reputations nowadays, but I believe Reddit was the first one to develop a negative reputation online. Rick and Morty, given the many science fiction themes it has, would end up attracting a largely nerd fan base. Now, it's important for me to note that around this time, nerd culture would start to change drastically. The idea of being a nerd was becoming a lot more appropriated. It was becoming normalized. Back in the 2000s, if you said you liked Star Wars in middle school, you would likely be stuffed into a locker. In the late 2010s though, if you said you liked Star Wars in middle school, people would be like, oh, I love Star Wars as well, I think it's great, I think it's amazing. And sometime in the late 2010s, Reddit began developing this reputation for being full of nerds and neckbeards and whatever. The idea of being a Redditor and a Rick and Morty fan began to overlap with each other, to the point where the two were basically synonymous with each other. And because of this, there was a belief that popped up out of nowhere that Rick and Morty was a show for smart people. You needed to have a high IQ, you needed to be highly intelligent in order to understand the comedic writing of Dan and Justin. Rick and Morty wasn't just a simple comedy, it wasn't a simple parody of Back to the Future. No. It was a deep show full of genius, well-written humor that only people with high IQs could understand. A lot of these people looked up to Rick Sanchez as a role model, as a hero, even though the whole point of his character is that he's meant to be a terrible person. You know that whole phenomenon where people worship and look up to Patrick Bateman from American Psycho or Walter White from Breaking Bad, even though the point is that they are meant to be terrible people? Yeah, something like that would happen with Rick Sanchez. Rick would become among these characters that people would look up to, people would idolize, even though they are terrible people. They are not role models, they are not characters that you are supposed to look up to. What didn't help things out either was the pessimistic, nihilistic, nothing in life matters, why should we care about anything style of humor that Rick has in the show. I guess this resonated with a lot of these pretentious freaks, and so they decided to adapt that into their lifestyle. And so rather bizarrely, these people tried to turn Rick and Morty into something that it wasn't. A deep, serious show for people with high IQs. People began posting all of these like memes and whatever, quotes from the show, thinking, oh, it's so deep and whatever. Rick and Morty is a deep show for high IQ people. And maybe at first glance you look at this and you think, okay, yeah, maybe this could be a little bit deep. But then you remember that this is the same show that has a character literally named Mr. Poopy Butthole. And that's when you realize, no, Rick and Morty is not a deep, smart show or anything like that. It's a fucking comedy. It's meant to make you laugh. Maybe there are a few serious moments sprinkled in here and there, but Rick and Morty is generally a comedy. To these people though, Rick and Morty was so much more than a comedy. It was a work of art. It was something genius, something that you needed to be super smart in order to understand. It was a show that was full of deep, meaningful quotes like this: "Roses are dead, love is fake, weddings are just basically funerals with cake." Oh man, you know, that's super deep. I'm not even gonna lie. I hate when I go to a wedding and I see a fucking dead body there, you know? That always sucks, doesn't it? Who can relate? And there's no way I can talk about the stereotype that Rick and Morty is only for smart people without bringing up the copy pasta. At some point in 2017, someone left a comment on a Reddit post, where else would they leave it, giving birth to one of the most infamous copy pastas on the internet. To be fair, you need to have a high IQ in order to understand Rick and Morty. No, I cannot be bothered to read the whole thing. The moment this comment was made, it was hit with instant ridicule, just like that. Nobody took this comment seriously. Nobody took the belief that Rick and Morty was for smart people seriously. Tons and tons of memes would be made making fun of those that thought Rick and Morty was for highly intellectual people. Joke copy pastas and memes and whatever would be made claiming that shows like Jimmy Neutron or Johnny Test were actually for smart people and not Rick and Morty. It was a crazy time. You just had to be there. To be fair, I could say that for a lot of the stuff in this video. You just simply had to be there. It's crazy to think that there are people that have yet to get into Rick and Morty. People that are only now starting to watch the show, that have just completely missed out on this point in time. They watch the show and they think it's a funny Back to the Future parody, and it's like they don't know anything about this stuff. About the musicallys, about the pretentious belief that the show was for smart people, about the third thing that we are going to be talking about in just a little bit. They just watch the show and they like it and they think it's funny, and that's it. And that's a crazy thought to me, I'm not even gonna lie. But with all of that said though, it's time to move on to the third and final reason as to why the Rick and Morty fanbase garnered the cringe reputation that it has today. 2 words. Szechuan sauce. If you know, you know. If you don't know, well, allow me to explain it to you. Back in 1998, to promote the then upcoming Disney movie Mulan, McDonald's released a limited-time sauce known as the Szechuan sauce. The sauce would end up being largely forgotten about, as would be the case with a lot of fast food promotional stuff, until almost 20 years later, when it would be brought up in the first episode of Season 3 for Rick and Morty. And it was with this that the Szechuan sauce would end up becoming a massive inside joke within the fandom. People began demanding that McDonald's bring back the Szechuan sauce, and eventually, they did. Around the latter half of 2017, around September to October or so, McDonald's actually did bring back the Szechuan sauce for a limited time. Something that they didn't take into consideration though, was how massive the Rick and Morty fandom was. I remember back when this was going on, I would find videos of people just lining up at different McDonald's locations, people just standing outside demanding that they wanted the Szechuan sauce. Even if the location that they were at was either out of Szechuan sauce, or they never had it to begin with, or they had a very limited amount. I came across a video of people rioting over a McDonald's not having Szechuan sauce, and apparently it seemed that the cops were involved with it as well, which is f***ing crazy to me. In retrospect, it feels even weirder looking at these videos now because it just shows you how massive Rick and Morty was at the time. And the fact that now it has fallen into complete irrelevancy is just, it feels so weird to me, I'm not even gonna lie. I look at this video and then I look at how Rick and Morty is nowadays and I just get reminded, oh yeah, Rick and Morty used to be the biggest thing in the world. That was a thing that happened. Of course though, I cannot talk about the Szechuan sauce stuff without bringing up this also infamous video of a guy freaking out at a public McDonald's restaurant because they didn't have the Szechuan sauce. Here's the video.
Wait, you guys no Szechuan sauce? No. I want Szechuan sauce. Where's my Szechuan sauce? I'm Pickle Rick. What beloved dum dum? I'm Pickle Rick. Rick. Rick! Rick! I'm Pickle Rick! Rick! Rick!
What the heck? What?
In retrospect, I'm pretty sure this was the video that single-handedly ruined Rick and Morty's reputation. Thanks to this one video, Rick and Morty went from being the most acclaimed cartoon of the 2010s to a complete joke, a laughingstock all over the internet. Rick and Morty would never be taken seriously again thanks to this video. And there you have it, folks, the 3 big reasons as to why Rick and Morty's fanbase garnered the cringe reputation that it has now. At first, people were willing to let the terrible nature of this fanbase slide because the show was good, but sooner or later, people would realize that maybe the show itself itself wasn't any better than the fandom it had. I'll get into that much later on. Even back then, I thought it was really weird to me to see how this show all of a sudden garnered this massively cringy fan base. Again, you gotta remember, the show came out in 2013. The fan base didn't become cringy, or at least it wasn't considered cringy until 2017. Between 2013 to 2016, I saw almost no one talk about the Rick and Morty fanbase in a negative way. I guess this could just, again, be the result of Rick and Morty becoming much more popular. Even though Rick and Morty was already universally acclaimed from the start, I guess it was comparatively more niche for its first 2 seasons, and then season 3 was when the show finally broke out into the mainstream. And so naturally that would lead to the fanbase of the show garnering a cringy reputation. Whatever the case may be, these 3 things not only ruined the reputation of the Rick and Morty fanbase, but it also ruined the reputation of Rick and Morty itself. 2017 to 2018 was the peak of the show, I would say. It was still massively popular in 2018, but then by 2019, the show was just nowhere near as big as it was. There was a massive, noticeable decrease in popularity starting in 2019. By the time season 4 premiered in November of 2019, Rick and Morty was no longer the pop culture phenomenon that it was just 2 years prior in 2017. Admittedly, I could just be misremembering this, or maybe I'm being biased. Maybe this is how I personally remember it, even though it's not how it actually was. But season 4 of the show didn't feel as big when compared to the first 3 seasons. Like, the hype surrounding it was just not on the same level. I want to imagine the show was still fairly popular during this time. There were still people that were excited for it, but it didn't feel as monumental as it did for season 3. And I think the cringy reputation that the show was starting to get greatly affected that. The same thing would happen with season 5 in 2021, season 6 in 2022, season 7 in 2023, and probably all future seasons from here on out. They just kind of came and went. They didn't feel as massive as the first 3 seasons, especially season 3.